When I was a couple weeks short of my 70th birthday, I started thinking about my mother's mother, who lived to be 100, and her mother, who lived to be 102, and my father, who lived to be 90, longer than anyone we had ever heard of in his family. I began to think that maybe our generation could be the first to routinely live to be 100. When I talked about this at family dinner one night, my granddaughter, who was 5, said,
"What are you going to do for the next 30 years, Grandpa?"
Hello, I'm Dr. Janet Price.
And I'm Gregg Kaloust. And we are Oldish. And this is our podcast, Oldish.
If you're oldish or know someone who is, please join us every week for conversations amongst ourselves
And our special guests
about what it means to be oldish in the 21st century.
If you ever wonder whether you're getting old, you're oldish. What are you going to do for the next 30 minutes? Hi, I'm Greg, and I'm oldish.
Hi, I'm Janet, and I'm oldish. Welcome to this episode of our podcast, Oldish, Conversations on Aging in the 21st Century. So, Greg, this is one of our favorite times, is when our friend and colleague, Leslie Ross-Degnan, joins us for another episode of a book review. Leslie, welcome. We're so glad you're here. We're always excited when you're here with us.
Thanks, Janet.
Hi, Leslie.
Hi, Greg. So the book for today is something you might have heard, The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. I think is part of our history that we all are usually, I think, assigned it in high school English. So it's very interesting to look back at it from an oldish perspective. So I'm going to hand it over to Leslie. She can give us some history around the author and the book, and then we'll jump into a conversation together.
Thanks, Janet. And hi, everybody. As Janet said, this is a well-known novel and a well-known writer. Everybody knows Ernest Hemingway. He's one of the greatest 20th century writers. And also, as she mentioned, we've all read his books one time or another. And this one, The Old Man and the Sea, is probably one of his most popular. You're probably more likely to have read this than some of his others. But other well-known books are The Sun Also Rises, The Snows of Kilimanjaro. Some of these will probably ring a bell and you'll say, oh, I read that in my English class in high school or my freshman year from college. For Whom the Bell Tolls. And I'll mention a few more as we go along, just to reflect on his style a little bit. So let me just jump in about Ernest Hemingway. Like the old man in our book, Santiago, Hemingway actually fished in the waters of Havana. He met a few Cuban fishermen, and he admired their way of life. He was a big traveler. He was a real adventurer. He went to a lot of places at a time when travel was a little more difficult than it is now. Prior to this book, Hemingway wrote an essay for Esquire magazine about an old man, a real old man, and honestly, a person who lived, Cuban man, who hooked a giant marlin with one of the heavy sash cord hand lines, the kind that Santiago used in the book, and who had a skiff that was also pulled out to sea for days by this fish that he caught. And the sharks came, of course, and they were still circling the boat when this fisherman was picked up by his friends, other fishermen. And I never knew that The Old Man of the Sea was based so literally on a real story. And this was written in 1952. And Hemingway won a Pulitzer Prize in 1953 for this book. And it's still, as I said, among his most popular books. It's very accessible. It has a lot of metaphor. It has it just has a lot in it for a very short novel, a novella, really. Other books that reflect this approach of reality that Hemingway used. During World War I, Hemingway was wounded on the Italian front. And he wrote a farewell to arms, and it was about that war. When he traveled to Spain and he became very enamored, most people know this about Hemingway, he became very enamored with bullfighting. He wrote his classic bullfighting novel, Death in the Afternoon. And others, Green Hills of Africa, That was about this guy loves adventure, his experiences as a big game hunter in Africa. And also the snows of Kilimanjaro was based on his African adventures. Let's focus a little bit on his characters. So most of Hemingway's main characters were young, strong men. None of them died of old age. Most of them died struggling to live. Even the old man in our story, who by all accounts, I mean, really, he should have died out at sea of dehydration, of nothing else, because he had this one little bottle of water, right? And he was out in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of the sun for 2 days almost, overnight, all night, all day, all night, and the next day. But he didn't. He struggled on, and he lived to tell the tale of how he defeated the giant marlin and the sharks. It's a very adventurous tale. So I looked up a little more information about the old man and the sea and about Hemingway and how it sort of reflected his own life. Hemingway worried a lot about aging and about becoming, this is a quote, a crotchety and senile old man. And he never saw himself sitting in an easy chair waiting for death. It wasn't loss of life so much that he feared, but loss of will, becoming passive, which to him, he saw that as a failure. He wanted to stay this strong, virile man his whole life, even as he was aging. Most of the virtues upon which Hemingway bases his art and his life were virtues of the young. And if you think about his novels that you've read and his main characters who were young men usually, you could see that. You could see it reflected. And it's certainly reflected in this old man. He's old, but he has so much youthfulness, so much fight still in him. And Hemingway, in fact, did not die of old age, as most of his main characters did not die of old age either. They're all young and strong and fighting for their lives. Hemingway, sadly, died by a self-inflicted gunshot wound. It was suicide, and he was only 61. But apparently, I read that he suffered from depression and bipolar disorder, which most likely went untreated at the time. He had it, and the thought of death by old age so terrified him that he took his own life.
As I was reading this book and thinking about Hemingway and did a little bit of, just reading the back page of it and read that he had taken his life by suicide, I did a little bit of research about suicide and aging, and it might even be something for us to have a whole episode on. But I had heard of this before, but I was fascinated to read again that more than half of deaths by suicide happen over 45 years of age and on up. And men are much more likely to end their life by suicide than women. And for example, there was a 29.6 per 100,000 for men over 55 who died by suicide and 6 per 100,000 for women over 55. And that the largest group of deaths by suicide for men happens 85 and above. So
Wow.
I find it incredibly fascinating. One of the articles I read was saying that one reason can be that men prize power, control, and invincibility throughout their lives. And inevitably, we lose that as we age. So just wanted to add that.
No, that's very interesting and really reflects the research that I did about Hemingway himself.
A couple of things about the bookness of the book before we get too far into the story. I do want to talk about the story. It's a great story. Hemingway hadn't written anything popular in 10 years. So I think that one of the things that was going on with Hemingway, our fisherman, the old man, our fisherman, had gone out 84 days in a row without catching a fish. So I think that's a pretty good metaphor for this is a really long stretch without the author fishing something up out of his subconscious to make a book out of it. So I want to talk about more about that in a little bit. But I also want to give a shout out to probably the most important person in American writing in the 20th century that very few people have actually heard of anymore. His name was Maxwell Perkins. Hemingway actually dedicated this story to him, as well as to Charles Scribner. Maxwell Perkins was an editor who worked at Charles Scribner's Sons, one of the huge publishers back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and probably, I think they're still around now, but probably I think they've been merged with somebody else. But Maxwell Perkins was the editor not only for Hemingway and discovered Hemingway, but also F. Scott Fitzgerald and Thomas Wolfe. So 3 of the major novelists of the 20th century American literary scene all had Maxwell Perkins in common, and to the extent that many critics used to wonder whether Maxwell Perkins actually wrote the books, especially with Thomas Wolfe, because Thomas Wolfe's writing was so messy. He guided these 3 major writers. There were a couple other somewhat lesser writers that he guided also, but he guided them to the extent that he's given credit for their style, for their subject matter, because he'd say, hey, Ernest, write me a book about this. And so Ernest Hemingway would do that. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Maxwell Perkins because he never gets that.
I think that's really interesting, Greg, because weren't these guys all a part of that group of authors that lived in Paris? And they had a name. I can't remember what it was.
The Lost Generation.
Yeah. There were a couple of other writers and poets in that group too, where they were just all kind of feeding off of each other.
And heavy drinkers and really prolific writers. And one other thing about the bookness of it is that Hemingway hadn't written anything for a long time, and a lot of people had started to write him off. But when this story came out, it's a novella, and the version that I read, it was 75 pages. It's not a full-length novel, which I think is one of the reasons why everybody used to read it in high school. I don't know whether they still do or not. But it won the Pulitzer Prize, as you said, Leslie, but it also, won him, this book didn't, but this book put him over the top for a Nobel Prize. So he won the Nobel Prize in 1956, I think. Might have been 1955. And the Nobel Committee said that The Old Man and the Sea put him over the top. They didn't give him the Nobel Prize for The Old Man and the Sea, but it kind of brought his writing to a peak.
He got the Nobel Prize for his body of work, right? Yeah.
Yes. But what tipped him over, in other words, he might not have without The Old Man and the Sea. It was widely considered to be the greatest American short story ever. And when it was actually published in Life magazine. It wasn't published originally in book form. It was published in Life magazine, and they sold 5 million copies of that issue of Life magazine that week.
Wow.
So it was incredibly popular. And it changed his career completely.
Well, it's a great story.
Yeah, so that's kind of important stuff, I think.
Oh, very. Very. Thanks for that. Thanks to both of you. It's all good information. So shall we talk about the story then?
I think so.
Yes, let's.
All right. So, of course, we want to talk about the Oldish themes and Santiago and his life. The first line of the book really sets it up nicely as a very good choice for this Oldish podcast. Here it is. He was an old man who fished alone in a skiff in the Gulf Stream, and he had gone 84 days now without taking a fish. That's just pretty much sets up the whole story and the struggle, and he's determined to do this no matter how old he is.
So the Oldish theme right out of the bat. Right?
Yep.
As soon as he got in the boat, the Oldish theme kicked in. Here's this old man fished alone. Everybody thought he was washed up, and he said, "No, I'm not." And he went out to catch the biggest fish of all.
And then there are these other beautiful quotes that say, like, his skiff is old and the sail is patched with flour sacks, like the flag of permanent defeat. I mean, just great writing. Everything about him was old except his eyes, and they were the same color as the sea and were cheerful and undefeated. This is sort of all setting up the story. So we know it's going to be about an old man who's determined and going to be undefeated.
And I love that sentence too. I actually wrote that down also as far as an oldishness, that as we age and our bodies change and our hair
gets white and we become more feeble, that our eyes can still be young and the same and not change and have a sparkle. So I noticed that also.
I would go even further with that and say that the sea itself was a metaphor for aging. Because look at the power of it. We have to face it. The old man had to face it. He had to manage it. He had to deal with it or die. And that's what aging is for. As they say, it's not for the weak. It's really hard to get old and graciously age. Santiago was a really old fisherman adrift at sea. And the sea was the person that he spoke to, in a way. It's with the sea that he explores his identity in pursuit of the big fish.
I was just going to say, you know, what was interesting for me as I read the book, and this might have happened to me in high school when I had to read it, is I didn't see a lot of that as I was reading, in the sense of him being undefeated, going after this prize or this accomplishment and never, I mean, he didn't give up. Every day he went out again, but to me, he seemed so almost hopeless, discouraged. Like when the boy wants to go out with him and he says, well, you can't because I'm not lucky. And sounds like the family had decided that because of things that had happened before, and or maybe the 84 days of no fish. I don't know. But I found myself thinking, this is like not hopeful for us as oldish people. So it was interesting for me because when I finished the book and I thought, and I read about this was just how popular it was, that it won these awards. And I thought, that's so interesting. It's like, it's almost like I didn't get it until I'd finished the book and did some research to find out what was the message here. So I just wanted to put that out there just in case there's any listeners who also have had that experience. I might be the only one, but just in case I'm not, it really helped, first of all, to read it and then to try to think about what does this all mean, and then looked forward to us talking about it together.
The oldishness, I think, was the point. Hemingway was saying, and it really seemed to me that Hemingway identified really strongly with the character Santiago. It wasn't just any old guy. A lot of it was a metaphor for himself and his career and how bleak things might have looked as he was sailing off into his own future. I did a fair amount of looking to find out if anybody had speculated on how old was the old man in the sea. And things ranged from, and also in my own interpretation, that person who lived the hard life that he had lived in poverty to a great extent, he might have been in his 50s, would have been really old in his 60s. The life expectancy for people living that way, life expectancy for just about everybody back in the 50s was 60s, or maybe you'd tip over into the 70s. So it was probably somewhere in there, but I couldn't find anything definitive. And then I looked, there are 3 movies that have been made from the book. One of them was the one that I remembered best, was Spencer Tracy. And even in the 60s, when I saw the Spencer Tracy movie, he was 57, I think, when he made the movie. He was white-haired, and when I was in high school, anybody with white hair was ancient. But Spencer Tracy was this old guy actor who made movies with Katharine Hepburn, and he was in his 50s when he made the movie, but they made him look older with makeup and whatnot. And the main thing about Spencer Tracy was he was essentially a middle-aged white guy playing an old Cuban guy, which nowadays wouldn't fly. So I want to see them remake the movie with Javier Bardem, I think, is could probably play that part. The second movie, I hadn't remembered seeing it. It was a made-for-TV movie that was made in 1990. It starred Anthony Quinn, and I think people who are oldish remember Anthony Quinn, but kids nowadays never heard of Anthony Quinn. He had the benefit of not being an old white guy. He was 75 when the movie was released, so he was 74, 75 when he made it, something like that. But he was a Mexican guy. Anthony Quinn was Mexican. His grandfather or somebody was Irish, which is why his last name was Quinn, but he was from Mexico, so he had that part covered. Plus, I always thought Anthony Quinn was an old Mexican guy. I don't remember any early movies that he was in. So there's a range there of what the movie makers thought of 55 to 75, maybe. The third film was actually an animated film that was made in 1999, won the Academy Award for Best Short in 1999. We all watched it today, I think. And it's just, if you get nothing else out of this book club, folks, go get that, find that movie. I'm going to post a link in the show notes. It's one of the prettiest things I've ever seen. It was just really, really well done, especially thinking 1999, but there's no CGI. It's all hand-painted animation. It was remarkable. And the character looked to me to be in his 60s. So that's how I think about the old man in the sea. I think when I was in high school, I was thinking, this guy must be 90. And holy smokes, that's pretty good for a guy that's 90. But now I realize that back then, 60s and 70s was really old and not oldish. But he had this quest and literally said, I'm not done yet, which is what we've been saying for 3 years is one of the hallmarks of being oldish as opposed to old, is you might be chronologically aged, your body might be starting to break down, but you're not done yet. And most men in their 40s, most men in their 30s couldn't have done what he did, bringing that fish in. Yeah.
When you were just talking about the animated version of this, which is beautiful and very watery, I mean, it made me think a lot about the sea and how important the setting in this book was, and the way that the animator made everything very watery. Even the clouds looked like the sea, and it was just beautiful. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the sea, actually, in the book, and how when you're, I don't know if either of you are sailors. I'm not a sailor, but there's something about being on water. I am a kayaker. There's something about being on water that just releases your mind, and I think there were moments in the book where he did that I thought were really beautiful. He's alone on the boat, away from the lights of Havana, and he had lots of moments of reminiscing about his youth, which I think is also a very oldish characteristic. The one memory that struck me was that he remembered being, as a youth, on a ship off the coast of Africa. I don't know how young he was in the book. I wasn't sure how young he actually was, if he was a boy or just a teenager or a young man. And he saw lions on the beach. And that was something that really impressed him. It impressed me as well. And I thought, oh, maybe Hemingway's bringing some of his African experiences into this Cuban story.
I wondered what that symbolized, the lion, because the very last line of the book is that he was dreaming about lions. And he talks about that earlier. What do you think the symbolism is for that?
Well, I think it's virility. I think it's hanging on to your youth. Also, that memory was a memory of youth. So I think the memory of youth and the virility of the lion probably was part of why he put that in there. And then he has all these thoughts about the things that he loves. And I thought this whole memory of baseball and Joe DiMaggio was really interesting. But it wasn't really just about baseball. It was about Joe DiMaggio's suffering from bone spurs in his heels. It was pretty specific, that memory that he had, which I think is also, it's a condition often of older people. So he was, kind of comparing himself to this younger man. This young man, he suffers too, and I'm suffering. And then he remembers also another young arm wrestling, which I thought was kind of an interesting memory too, but also one of strength and virility. Where he's arm wrestling this large African-American man, very muscular, winner of all the wrestling matches. And the match lasted for a day and overnight, which I thought reflected his journey. Mm-hmm. He was reflecting on his strength as a young man and trying to pull that into his experience on the boat to survive as an old man. And then he does these other things, like compares his hands to those of the sea turtle. Now I have these old hands and they're like the fins of a sea turtle. I just loved all of these images.
One of the things that made me think of, this is a little bit of an aside, but if anybody who's listening saw the movie Galaxy Quest from a long time ago with Tim Allen and so many people in it. And when I saw it at the time, one of the themes in the book, or one of the mantras that they say, is never give up, never surrender. And I've remembered that. I mean, it was such a long time ago, but as I am a psychotherapist, and I often think of it when I'm talking with clients, and I say, never give up, never surrender. And so here it is, this whole book about never give up, never surrender. And he didn't.
No, he did not. In fact, there was a beautiful quote in there that said, "But man is not made for defeat. A man can be destroyed, but not defeated." And so the whole time he's fighting for his life and determined to beat this marlin. And then the sharks come. And I'm wondering, are the sharks another metaphor for aging? Once one problem is overcome, another shows up. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, that's a really interesting. And again, as I was reading it, I kept thinking while I was reading it, what is the end of this going to be? Is he going to die in the boat because he's out in the middle of nowhere and he's old and he's been working so hard? Or what's going to happen? And I wasn't expecting that he would catch this huge fish, that he'd be bringing it back. And so that was an exciting moment. Never give up, never surrender. But then the sharks come, and I felt like, okay, what is the point of this book? That you can work really, really hard and reach your biggest dream and accomplish so much. And then the sharks are going to come and they're just going to eat it all up. And by the time you get back to shore, you're this physically broken person, in the sense that he hurt his hands, he hurt his back. He's exhausted in ways only an oldish person could be with all of that. So I was left with kind of like, okay, so the message is never give up until everything gets taken from you and your best success is ripped apart, but keep going.
Yep, keep going. And to a certain extent, even though he didn't return with a fish that had economic value, it had great story value. People had been giving him a hard time. The sharks in the village had been giving him a hard time, so to speak, about not getting any fish for 84 days, which that's a long time. That's like 3 months of going out in the boat every day and coming back with nothing. Well, that seems like a pretty long time. But he returned not with a fish story, but kind of with a shark story, because the fish was longer than his boat, and he had lashed it to the boat, and the sharks had eaten all the flesh off of the fish, but the skeleton of this fish was still there, and everybody in the village was like, holy cow, look at the size of this thing. What a man he must be to have caught this fish. And yeah, so he got the story value. He didn't get the economic value of the fish. And he woke up the next day or a couple days later, all in pain and laying in his bed, and started talking to his companion, the young boy who went fishing with him. Let's go fishing again. So he was not defeated. He didn't get that particular fish, but he got the symbol of the fish returned in his life.
That's not what I remember from the end of the book. The end of the book was that he was almost unconscious on his bed, that the little boy runs up to see if he's still alive, finds out he is alive, brings him something to drink. And that when he does wake up and the boy says, let's go out again because you're my teacher and you have so much to teach me. He's like, you don't want me to come? It didn't seem like he was like, yeah, look what I did. And even though the big fish, the meat all got eaten, you can see what I caught and now I'm a hero. It was almost like, no, I'm still not any good. Because, I mean, it was interesting because it didn't seem to energize him. It didn't seem to be like, yeah, look what I did. Instead, because I thought when the boy said, let's go out, he goes, no, you don't want me to go out with you. I'm not lucky. He was similar. But then the boy, which I think would be interesting to talk about too, is what was the role of that boy and what did he represent? But he reminded the man or the old man, or at least gave him the reality that you're a hero and you have a lot to teach me and all of that.
I think the boy was a part of, if you wanted to call this a love story, I would say that there was a lot of love between the boy and the man, and a lot of struggle in the man between his youth and his old age. So I think it was an interesting juxtaposition of his love for the boy and the boy's youthfulness and his appreciation for how important the boy was in his life. In fact, when he was out at sea, he said nobody should be alone in old age. That was one of his sort of musings. And he missed the boy a lot who helped him. And he was hoping that he'd live to see him again. And I think the boy, in some ways, was part of his motivation to get back, to live, to catch the fish and show the boy and the boy's parents that he still had it in him. I think it was a sense of pride for the old man to redeem himself in the community that, I'm old, I'm not useless. I can still do this, even though the sharks got my fish. It was pretty impressive when the villagers came down and saw his boat with that huge skeleton of a fish attached to it still. So in the end, it wasn't really about the fish. It wasn't about catching the fish, because the fish, he didn't get any of the fish. He didn't get a penny for the fish. He didn't go to market with it and sell it like he was planning. In the end, it was just that he redeemed himself. He became the young person for a while that he hoped he would.
And nobody had ever caught a fish that big. Nobody had seen a fish that big. One of the things we should throw in here about the fish is that the fish had to be oldish too, because that kind of fish keeps growing. So it's not like that fish had been the same size for 15 years. That had to have been an old fish. Also very strong. The boat for 2 days.
Yeah, there was a definite correspondence between the struggle of the man and the struggle of the fish, for sure.
One of the things that kind of came to me in my own thoughts around the relationship between, or what the symbolism was for the boy, was what touched me, or what thoughts I had were that of getting old and having to let go of our children as they grow up. And I don't know why my mind went in this direction, but they go off into their lives and we are not intimately connected to them on a day-to-day basis. And so I wrote down one quote, which was, "I wish I had the boy, but you haven't got the boy," he thought. "You only have yourself." And just that sense of the boy was out there. He knew the boy was out there. He knew the boy was helpful and loved him, but wasn't there with him. And he had to face this alone. And so I definitely feel like being oldish, aging, is something I face alone, as far as my kids aren't actively involved, nor do I want them to be, in how I'm feeling about being oldish, what my experiences are. So that was something I was thinking about with the boy.
Well, yeah, and the boy was like really just beginning his life as a fisherman, and the old man was ending his life as a fisherman and slowly coming to the end. So the boy was just, for him, a symbol of ongoing life. Yeah, it was very tender, this relationship with the boy.
One of the things that the old man modeled was, we have been saying, not giving up, and also being positive, having a positive perspective. And so I have the quote, "He had the pain in his back from the cord," quote, "but I have had worse things than that," he thought. So there was always this acknowledgement of how things were going, and then taking this positive view of, okay, all right, I've had worse things. I'll manage, this will be okay. So I thought that was lovely.
This is a really quotable book because the way that Hemingway writes, it's all kind of short, succinct things. I want to read a couple of quotes too, just because I wrote some down and I don't usually do that. When he was fighting off the sharks, we talked about he's sailing with this boat coming along and the sharks came, but he didn't just say, "Oh, there's sharks, they're eating up my fish." He fought them. He took his harpoon and he killed a couple of the sharks with his harpoon. And when his harpoon broke, he started beating him with a stick from the harpoon. And then he lashed an old knife to an oar and was using that to fight him off. And until there was a whole bunch of them, he succeeded. So he was overwhelmed by force of the sharks. But when he was lashing his knife to the oar, he said, "Now," he said, "I am still an old man, but I am not unarmed." So it's like, I have some resources here.
And isn't that true of all of us? I mean, we're all getting old, but we're not unarmed.
And what you were saying, Leslie, before about what the sharks represent. And Greg, as you're talking, I'm thinking, as these sharks come at us, as we're aging, we fight them off, we do our best, we have wins, but we have losses, and eventually the ultimate end that we die.
Yes. I have 3 or 4 more quotes, but I'm not going to read them all. But there was a lot of literary criticism about this book, a big school of which was that it was full of Christian symbolism.
Oh, yeah, I heard that. Yeah.
Hemingway denied it. He said, nope, there's no Christian symbolism. It's a story of a man and a big fish. But there was Christian symbolism without even having to poke at it too hard. So the symbolism was there, whether Hemingway intended it or not. The fact that the fisherman was named Santiago, which is the Spanish name of St. James, who was one of the apostles in the Gospels and was a fisherman. And I have a special attachment because walking part of the Camino in Spain, the end point of the Camino is the shrine of Santiago, where supposedly his bones are buried. But anyway, that's beside the point. But at one point, this was the one line in the whole book that said, I don't care what you say, Hemingway, this is Christian symbolism, where the fish was tearing his hands up he was trying to hold the line with his hands. And at one point, he said aloud, A-Y, there is no translation for this word, and perhaps it is just a noise such as a man might make involuntarily, feeling the nail go through his hands and into the wood. Pretty sure that there's some Christian symbolism there.
Yeah, that's pretty literal.
The last Oldish quote, which is really good, after the knife that he lashed to the oar to kill the sharks with wasn't particularly sharp. So he said, I wish I had a stone for the knife, the old man said after he had checked the lashing on the oar butt. I should have brought a stone, meaning a sharpening stone. You should have brought many things, he thought, but you did not bring them, old man. Now is no time to think of what you do not have. Think of what you can do with what there is. That is Oldish in a nutshell right there.
Oh, totally. In the most positive sense,
Yes.
being positive in the midst of, I don't have this anymore. I can't reach for that. My body doesn't work this way, but let's see what I can do with what I have.
Well, that's a good place to wrap it up, don't you think?
I do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, as usual, I've said this more than once in our book club podcast, is the experience of reading a book, knowing that you two are reading it and that we're going to talk about it, has really enriched my reading of the book. This book was really rich to me, and I might have read it in 2 or 3 hours. It's only 75 pages, and just said, oh, yeah, that's a great book. But because I knew we were going to be talking about it, and I knew that you would have your own insights, it's a really much more rich experience of the book than I would have had otherwise. So once again, thank you both very much for enriching a book for me. And books are right up there in the top 10 most important things in my life. And so thank you.
Yeah, me too.
Absolutely. Thank you, Leslie, for your insight and helping us understand Hemingway and the history of the book. And thank you to Greg and Leslie. This has been very, very interesting and definitely oldish.
Oh, yes, Janet. And thanks to you for all your psychological references. I love it when you do that. You're looking up like how many people die over a certain age. And I think it's great. It really enriches the conversation.
Oh,
Thank you for that too.
You're welcome. All right. So next we can announce what our next book is going to be for all of you readers, listeners, so you can be reading along and get ready for our next book review. So Leslie, what are we doing next?
Okay, so we haven't done this yet, but we're going to try to be a little bit more conscientious about naming the next book so y'all could read it. But our next book is by the author Judith Viorst, who you might know as an author of children's books. She wrote, which I think is also a very kind of oldish picture book, is Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. Nobody has days like that, right? When they're over 60.
One of my favorite books.
Yeah. Well, we're not going to read that book, so you have to read that on your own. But Judith Viorst wrote a series of poems called Decades Poems, and they start at 30 and go up to 90. So every 10 years, she wrote another one of these, and it's a collection of humorous poems filled with lots of advice and reflections on living, on life, on marriage, on children, on grandchildren. And there's one for every decade starting at 30, but we're going to just do 60, 70, and 80. So if you want a good laugh about aging, read one of these books. Pick out anyone, 60, 70, 80, pick out 90 if you want. And you'll have a good laugh about these. So what we're going to do is, since it is April and it's Poetry Month, we are choosing a book of poetry. So we thought this would be fun and funny and poetic. So the Poetics of Aging is coming up with our next book group, books by Judith Viorst, Viorst. And I guess we'll put it in the on the website, Greg.
Yeah, I'll put it on the website and in the show notes. And apparently I've been assigned reading the poems from the 80s. So I'm looking forward to getting that book and reading a few poems about what I have to look forward to.
Okay.
Exactly.
All right.
And I've been assigned the 30s because, I'm just staying there.
You've not been assigned 30s.
Oh.
Yeah, 39 again.
Well, I think we're going to have fun with these books. So
Yes.
I can tell.
Yes.
Yes. All right. Well, until next time, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye, Janet. Bye, Leslie.
Bye, Greg. Bye, Leslie.
Bye, Janet. Bye, Greg. It was real.
That's it for now. Thanks for listening. As always, we had a great time reading and discussing this book and learned a lot. We hope you did too. You can find links to the animated film of The Old Man and the Sea and to a paperback edition of the book on our website at www.oldish.me. We are no longer Amazon affiliates for various reasons. We suggest you buy the books we discuss in the book club and those written by our guests on bookshop.org. The service is excellent, and you can choose a local or other independent bookshop, and that store will receive a large portion of the purchase price. It combines the convenience of online shopping with support for local stores. Thanks. Please consider becoming one of a growing number of paid subscribers. It doesn't take much and helps us to keep producing this important podcast. There is a button on our website. If you leave a rating or review on our website or wherever you listen to podcasts, it helps people to find us, as does sharing us with a friend. If you have a comment or a request for a topic or a guest, you can post those from our website as well. And don't forget to love everyone.